I didn't mean to start a war, but the moment my hand touched her, everything changed. The sound came first, sharp and clean, like crystal cracking under pressure, and for a second I thought it was another glass hitting the marble floor, because in a place like this, accidents happened quietly and were forgotten even faster. But this wasn't that kind of sound. This was louder, heavier, the kind that made conversations stall mid-sentence and forks freeze halfway to perfectly polished lips. And when I realized it had come from me, from my own trembling hand, it was already too late to take it back, too late to pretend I was still invisible like I had been 10 minutes ago when I was just another waitress in a black uniform, balancing a tray of champagne flutes and trying not to think about the rent due next week or the dull ache in my ribs that never fully went away, because invisibility had always been my survival skill, blending into the background, smiling at people who never looked twice at me. But tonight the room felt different the moment he walked in, Adrian Volkov. A name I didn't hear spoken but felt in the way the air shifted, in the way the staff straightened their posture and the manager suddenly cared about every detail, in the way people moved aside without being asked, like something powerful had entered the room and everyone knew it except me. Or maybe I knew it too and just didn't want to admit it, because men like him didn't exist in my world, not really. They belonged to headlines and whispers, to stories people told in low voices, and yet, there he was, sitting at the center table like the entire place had been built around him, dark suit, calm eyes, not loud, not dramatic, just present in a way that made everything else feel smaller, and beside him was her, Victoria Hale, perfect in a way that made you feel like you were looking at something expensive and untouchable, the kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to make someone feel beneath her, and unfortunately, tonight, that someone was me. It started with a glance, then a comment, then another, subtle at first, the kind of thing you could brush off if you tried hard enough. But I had learned long ago that some people didn't want service, they wanted control, and the more I stayed quiet, the more she pushed, until her words turned sharper, her tone colder, and then her hand reached out, not violently, not aggressively, just enough to cross a line that shouldn't have been crossed, a touch that wasn't about contact but about power, and something inside me, something buried and tired of being silent, finally snapped. My hand moved before my mind caught up, a reflex more than a decision, and the moment it happened, the room went still, every sound swallowed by the weight of what I had just done. My heart slammed against my chest, my fingers burned, and for a brief second I forgot how to breathe because I knew exactly who she was standing next to. I knew what kind of man he was supposed to be, and I knew that people like me didn't get second chances after crossing people like them. So I braced myself for the consequences, for the anger, for the quiet destruction that would follow. But when I forced myself to look up, it wasn't her reaction that froze me in place. It was his, because Adrian Volkov wasn't looking at me with anger. He wasn't even looking at me at all. His eyes were on her, calm, unreadable, and somehow that was more terrifying than anything I had imagined. No one moved. Not the guests, not the staff, not even Victoria, whose perfect posture seemed to crack just enough for me to notice the disbelief in her eyes as she slowly lifted her hand to her cheek, not in pain but in shock, like she could not quite understand how something like this had happened to her, to someone like her, and the silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until I became painfully aware of every detail around me, the faint clink of ice settling in a glass somewhere across the room, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the way my own breathing sounded too loud in my ears, uneven and shallow, and I realized I was still holding the tray, my fingers locked around the edge so tightly that my knuckles had turned white, and I forced myself to loosen my grip before I dropped it and made everything worse, if that was even possible, because I had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, already stepped into a space where I did not belong. And the only thing left was to face whatever came next, and slowly, almost reluctantly, Victoria turned her head toward him, toward Adrian, as if seeking confirmation that reality would correct itself, that he would restore order, that he would remind everyone who held the power in this room. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out, and for the first time since I had seen her, she looked uncertain, and that was when he finally moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just a subtle shift as he set his glass down on the table with a quiet, deliberate motion, the kind that drew attention without demanding it, and every instinct in my body told me to look away, to lower my gaze, to make myself small again. But I could not. I was caught in the moment, held there by something I could not explain. Because his expression did not match the situation, there was no anger, no immediate reaction, just a calm that felt heavier than any outburst could have been. And when he stood, the room seemed to adjust around him. Conversations that had tried to resume faltered again, and even the manager near the entrance stopped mid-step, watching, waiting, because whatever he was about to do would define what happened next, not just for me, but for everyone in that room. And I felt it in the way my heartbeat stuttered, in the way my chest tightened, preparing for the worst, because men like him did not need to raise their voice to end someone like me. They did not need to explain themselves or justify their actions. They simply decided, and the world adjusted accordingly. And for a brief second, I wondered if this was how it ended, not with chaos or noise, but with a quiet decision made by someone who had never been told no. And then he took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and Victoria, his gaze never once shifting toward me. And when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, controlled in a way that made it impossible to ignore. "Do not touch her again." And it took a moment for the words to settle, for my mind to catch up and understand what I had just heard, because he was not speaking to me. He was not even acknowledging me. His attention, his command, was directed entirely at her, and the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like the axis of the room had tilted, and suddenly the balance of power was no longer where it had been seconds ago. Victoria's expression changed again, confusion flashing into something sharper, something wounded in a way that had nothing to do with the physical and everything to do with pride. "Adrian," she started, her voice softer, now almost careful, but he did not respond, did not offer reassurance or explanation, just held her gaze for a second longer before turning slightly, just enough for his presence to extend beyond her, just enough for me to feel it without him fully looking at me. And that was when I understood something I had never experienced before, that protection did not always come with warmth, that it could be cold, calculated, and just as dangerous as the threat it replaced. And my pulse quickened again, not from fear this time, but from something more complicated, something I did not yet have a name for, because I knew, standing there in that silence, that whatever had just happened was not over, not even close. Victoria did not step back, not at first, and that told me everything about the kind of world she came from, the kind where being corrected in public was not just uncomfortable, but unacceptable. And I watched the way her posture stiffened, the way her chin lifted just slightly, as if she could hold on to control by refusing to acknowledge that it had slipped. But there was something different now, something fragile beneath the polished surface, because Adrian had not raised his voice, had not explained himself, and somehow that made it worse, made it final in a way that no argument could undo. And the people around us felt it too. I could see it in the way their eyes moved, quick glances exchanged, silent calculations happening behind composed expressions, because power in a room like this was not loud. It was observed, measured, remembered. And I was suddenly very aware that I had become part of that memory, whether I wanted to or not. My name unknown, but my face marked. The girl who crossed a line and was not immediately erased for it. And that realization sent a new kind of unease through me, one that settled deeper than fear, because fear I understood. Fear was simple, predictable, but this shift, this unexpected protection, it complicated everything, and I did not know what to do with it. My instincts told me to apologize, to fix it, to make myself small again and disappear into the rhythm of service. But my feet would not move, my voice would not come. And before I could decide, Victoria spoke again, her tone carefully controlled, each word placed with precision. "She is staff," she said, as if reminding him, as if reminding everyone. And there was a pause after that, a brief moment where the air seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see if he would agree, if he would restore the expected order. But Adrian did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, and in that look was something quiet and absolute, something that did not need to be explained to be understood. And when he finally spoke, it was even softer than before, but somehow it carried further. "And you will treat her with respect." And the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else could have, because it was not a suggestion, not a negotiation. It was a decision, and I felt it ripple outward, felt the way the staff nearby straightened just a little more, the way the tension shifted from sharp to something steadier, and Victoria's expression flickered, just for a second, before it settled back into something composed, something practiced, but the moment had already changed her position in the room, and she knew it, even if she refused to show it fully. And then, without another word, Adrian turned, not dramatically, not as a dismissal, but as if the conversation was already over in his mind, and that was when his gaze finally moved, not directly, not fully, but enough to catch mine for the briefest second, and it felt like being seen in a way I had not expected, not as background, not as staff, but as something more defined, something acknowledged, and it sent a strange, unsettling warmth through my chest that I immediately tried to ignore. Because I knew better than to read meaning into moments like that, knew better than to believe that someone like him could truly see someone like me beyond a passing decision. And yet my pulse betrayed me, quickening again, my thoughts tangling as I tried to return to something normal, something safe. But normal was gone now, replaced by a quiet awareness that everything had shifted, not just in the room, but in whatever invisible line had existed between his world and mine. And as I finally forced myself to move, to step back and lower my gaze, to pick up the pieces of my role and pretend this was just another night, I could not shake the feeling that I had just stepped into something I did not understand, something that would not let me walk away as easily as I wanted. Because as I turned to leave, I heard his voice again, not loud, not meant for the room, but clear enough for me to catch, "Stay." And I froze before I even realized I had stopped moving. The word did not sound like an order, not in the way I expected. It was too quiet for that, too controlled. But somehow it held me in place more effectively than anything louder could have, and I felt it settle into the space between us. Not just a request, not just a suggestion, something else entirely, something that made my body react before my mind had time to catch up, my steps halting mid-motion, my breath catching as I stood there with my back half-turned, caught between leaving and obeying. And for a second I considered pretending I had not heard him, considered continuing forward and disappearing into the kitchen where things still made sense, where trays and orders and routine could swallow this moment whole. But I knew better, because people like him were not ignored, not accidentally, not safely, and slowly, carefully, I turned back, my movements measured as if anything sudden might break whatever fragile balance had formed in the room. And when I faced him again, his attention was fully on me for the first time, not passing, not indirect, but focused, and it felt different than I expected, not invasive, not assessing in the way customers usually looked at me, but deliberate, like he was choosing to see something rather than simply noticing it. And it made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because I was not used to being the center of that kind of attention, not from anyone, let alone someone like him. And I became acutely aware of everything. The way my uniform felt suddenly too plain, the faint scent of citrus cleaner still clinging to my hands, the quiet tremor in my fingers that I tried to still by pressing them against the edge of the tray, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just enough to make me question what he wanted, what this meant, because this was not how situations like this were supposed to go. There was supposed to be anger, consequences, something clear and immediate, but instead there was this pause, this space where something unspoken was taking shape. And behind him I could feel Victoria's presence like a shadow that had not fully retreated, her silence heavier now, sharper, but she did not interrupt again, and that alone told me that whatever had shifted had not shifted back. And finally, Adrian spoke, his voice low enough that it did not carry far, but steady enough that I felt every word land. "What is your name?" And the question caught me off guard, simple in structure, but heavy in implication, because it meant acknowledgement. It meant I was no longer just part of the background, and for a second my mind blanked, as if the answer had been erased by the tension of the moment, before I managed to find my voice, quieter than I intended but clear enough. "Hannah," I said, forcing myself not to look away, because something told me that looking away now would undo whatever fragile thread had formed between us. And his gaze did not shift, did not soften, but there was a subtle change, something almost imperceptible that made me feel as though he had filed that information away, as though my name now existed somewhere in a world I had never been part of before, And then he nodded once, a small, almost unnoticeable gesture, but final in its own way. Hannah, he repeated, not questioning, not testing, simply stating it, and the sound of my name in his voice felt unfamiliar, like it carried a different weight than it ever had before, and I swallowed, trying to steady the sudden rush of nerves that followed, unsure of what came next, unsure of why this mattered, because it should not have mattered. It should have been just another interaction, another moment in a long shift, but nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. And when he leaned back slightly, reclaiming his space without breaking eye contact completely, I realized that whatever this was, whatever line had been crossed tonight, it had not been erased, it had been redrawn, and I was now standing on the wrong side of it. Or maybe the right side. I could not tell yet, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. There was no going back to being invisible after this. The way he said my name did not fade after the sound ended. It lingered, quiet but persistent, like something had been set in motion that I could not see yet, and I stood there for a second longer than I should have, unsure whether I was supposed to speak again, or step away, or simply exist in this strange new space where I was no longer invisible, and it felt wrong, unfamiliar, like wearing something that did not belong to me. Because attention like this always came with a cost, and I had spent most of my life learning how to avoid that cost, how to move through rooms without drawing focus, how to survive by being overlooked. But now that strategy had been stripped away in a matter of seconds, replaced by something I did not understand, something that made every instinct in my body stay alert, waiting for the moment when the balance would snap back and everything would correct itself, and yet it did not happen. Instead, Adrian shifted his gaze slightly, just enough to acknowledge the table again, as if the situation had already been resolved in his mind, as if nothing more needed to be said, and that quiet certainty settled over the room, giving people permission to breathe again, to move, to return to their conversations in careful, measured tones. But nothing was quite the same. I could feel it in the way people glanced in my direction when they thought I would not notice, in the way the other staff kept their distance without being told, and even my manager, who usually would have rushed in to fix anything remotely out of place, stayed where he was, watching, calculating, as if stepping in now would be a mistake he could not afford. And that realization sent a chill through me, because it meant this moment did not belong to me anymore. It belonged to him, and whatever happened next would follow his lead, not mine. And slowly, carefully, I lowered my gaze just enough to signal compliance without completely retreating, because something told me that disappearing now would be seen as avoidance rather than respect, and I steadied my voice, keeping it even despite the tension coiling in my chest. "Would you like me to bring anything else?" I asked, the words automatic, familiar, a small attempt to anchor myself back into the role I understood, the one that had rules and boundaries. But the question felt different in the air between us, less like service and more like a test. And for a moment he did not answer, his eyes studying me again, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me aware of myself, of the way I stood, the way I held my shoulders, the way I chose to stay instead of retreat. And I wondered what he saw, what he was measuring, because it did not feel random. It felt intentional, like he was deciding something I had no control over. And then he gave the smallest shake of his head. "No," he said, simple, final, but he did not dismiss me either, did not look away. Immediately, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second where his attention lingered, told me that this interaction was not as finished as it appeared, that something remained unresolved beneath the surface, and I felt it settle into my thoughts, heavy and quiet, as I finally stepped back. One step, then another, each movement careful, deliberate, until I was no longer standing directly in front of him, until I could breathe without feeling the weight of his gaze quite as strongly. And yet, even as I turned, even as I forced myself to walk toward the service station where orders waited and glasses needed refilling and everything should have returned to normal, I could not shake the awareness that followed me, that invisible thread that had formed the moment he said my name, the moment he chose to step in, because choices like that did not happen without reason, not in his world. And as I reached for a fresh tray, my hand steadier now, but my mind anything but, I realized that whatever reason he had, whatever decision he had made tonight, it was not something I could simply walk away from, no matter how much I wanted to pretend I could. By the time I reached the service station, the noise of the restaurant had returned, but it felt different now, like a layer had been added beneath it, something quieter and sharper that only I seemed to notice, and I focused on the small tasks in front of me, aligning glasses, adjusting napkins, pretending that everything was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago, because routine was safe. Routine did not ask questions, but my hands moved on their own while my thoughts stayed somewhere else entirely, replaying the moment again and again. The way he had looked at her, the way he had said those words, the way he had said my name, and none of it fit into anything I understood. None of it followed the rules I had spent years learning, because men with that kind of presence did not intervene for people like me, not without a reason, and I could not find one that made sense, not one that justified the shift I had felt ripple through the room, and I was still trying to steady myself. When I noticed the change, subtle at first, just a shift in movement near the entrance, a few men stepping inside who did not belong to the usual crowd, not customers, not staff, their posture too precise, their attention too focused, and I felt it before I fully saw it. The way the energy in the room tightened just slightly, the way conversations dipped in volume without anyone consciously deciding to lower their voice. And instinctively, I glanced toward the main floor, toward the table I had just left, because somehow I knew it had something to do with him. And I was right. Adrian had not moved much, but the space around him had changed. The men who had entered positioned themselves with quiet intention, not surrounding him, not overtly guarding, but close enough to signal something important without making a scene, and it made my stomach tighten, because whatever world he belonged to had just stepped a little closer into mine, and I suddenly felt very out of place standing there with a tray in my hands, like I had wandered into something I was not meant to witness, and for a second I considered stepping back, retreating fully into the kitchen, telling myself that none of this was my concern, but before I could act on that thought, one of the men turned his head slightly, just enough to catch my direction, and it was not a threatening look, not direct, but it was aware, and that was enough to make my pulse quicken again, because being noticed by one of them meant I was no longer just an observer, and I lowered my gaze immediately, focusing on the tray in front of me as if it demanded my full attention, but the feeling did not go away, that quiet awareness that something was unfolding, something controlled and deliberate, and then, through the reflection of the polished metal surface, I saw a movement, Adrian standing again, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with purpose, and the room adjusted around him once more, subtle but undeniable. And this time, when he turned, it was not toward Victoria, not toward the table, but toward the space where I stood, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because I knew, without him saying a word, that this was not coincidence, that whatever had started minutes ago had not ended when I stepped away. It had only shifted direction, and as he began to walk, each step measured and unhurried, I felt that invisible line between us tighten, pulling me back into a moment I had tried to leave behind, and every instinct told me to move, to create distance, to return to the safety of anonymity, but my feet stayed rooted, my hands still against the tray, as if part of me understood that running now would only make things worse. And when he finally stopped, a few feet away, close enough that I could hear the faint sound of his breath over the noise of the room, I realized that whatever this was, whatever decision he had made, it was no longer happening at a distance. It was happening directly in front of me, and there was no way to pretend otherwise anymore. He did not speak right away, and that silence felt intentional, like he was giving the moment time to settle into something solid before adding anything to it. And I stood there with the tray still in my hands, aware of how close he was now, aware of how the air seemed to shift again, not dramatically, not enough for the entire room to stop this time, but enough for me to feel it in the way my breath slowed, in the way my thoughts sharpened despite the tension, because this was no longer something happening across the room. This was direct, focused, impossible to ignore, and I forced myself to meet his gaze, even though every instinct told me to look down, to retreat, to remind both of us that I was just staff and this did not need to go any further. But something in his presence made that feel like the wrong move, like stepping back now would undo something that had already been decided. And I did not understand why I felt that so clearly, only that I did, and finally he spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying just enough weight to reach me without drawing unnecessary attention. You handled that differently than most would. he said, and for a second I was not sure how to respond, because it was not a question, not exactly a compliment either, more like an observation, something he had noted and filed away, and I swallowed, steadying my voice before answering. I should not have, I said, the words coming out softer than I intended, but honest, because no matter what had followed, I knew crossing that line had been a risk, one I had not thought through in the moment, and his expression did not change much, but there was a slight shift in his eyes, something thoughtful, something measured. And yet you did, he replied, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten again, because he was not correcting me, not dismissing the action, just acknowledging it as a fact, and that felt more significant than anything else could have, and for a brief moment. Neither of us spoke again, the space between us filled with something unspoken, something that felt like a question, without being asked, and I became aware of the world around us again, the quiet movement of the staff, the distant hum of conversation, the presence of the men who had entered earlier still lingering at the edges of my awareness, and I realized that whatever this was, it was happening within a larger structure I could not see, something controlled and deliberate that extended beyond this one interaction. And that realization grounded me just enough to find my footing again, to remind myself that no matter how unusual this felt, I was still standing in my place, still part of a world with rules, even if they had shifted slightly, and I adjusted my grip on the tray, using the small movement to steady myself. I was just doing my job, I added, though even as I said it, I knew it was not entirely true, because my job did not include crossing boundaries or challenging people like her. And he seemed to recognize that too, the corner of his expression tightening just slightly, not amusement, not disapproval, something in between. Your job, he repeated, as if testing the phrase, as if considering what it meant in this context. And then his gaze moved briefly, just for a second, toward the main floor, toward the table where Victoria still sat, composed but quieter now, before returning to me. And when he spoke again, his tone shifted just enough to make me pay closer attention. That is not the only thing you did tonight. And the words settled into me with a weight I did not fully understand yet, because they suggested something more, something beyond the obvious. And I felt my pulse pick up again, not from fear this time, but from the sense that I was standing at the edge of something I could not see clearly, something that was about to take shape whether I was ready or not. And I held his gaze, waiting, not because I was certain I should, but because walking away no longer felt like an option. And in that moment, I realized that whatever happened next would not be something I chose. It would be something I stepped into, willingly or not. The words stayed with me longer than they should have. Not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore, and I felt them settle somewhere deeper than the surface of the moment, like they carried a meaning I had not fully caught yet. And I stood there, still holding his gaze, trying to understand what he meant without asking. Because something told me that asking questions in his world was not always safe, not always welcome. And yet the silence stretched just enough to make it feel like he was waiting, not for an answer, but for something else, something internal, something I was supposed to realize on my own. And I became aware of how steady he looked, how certain, like every word he spoke had already been considered before it ever left his mouth. And it made me feel unprepared in a way I did not like, because I had always relied on reacting quickly, adapting, surviving in the moment. But this was different. This required something slower, something more deliberate, and I was not sure I had time for that. Not here, not with him standing this close. And I forced myself to breathe evenly, to keep my voice level when I finally spoke. I did not mean for any of that to happen. I said, the truth simple and unpolished, because anything else would have sounded like an excuse. And his expression did not change, but there was a shift in the way he held my gaze, something more focused, more intent, as if he was weighing not just the words but the reason behind them. And for a moment I wondered what he saw, whether he believed me or whether belief even mattered in this situation. And then he gave a slight nod, not agreement, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. Intent does not change impact, he said quietly, and the words landed with a calm certainty that made it clear he was not correcting me, just stating a principle, something he lived by. And I felt that same tightening in my chest again, because it made sense in a way I could not argue with. And yet it also meant that whatever had happened tonight could not simply be undone by explaining it away, and that realization made everything feel heavier, more permanent, and I shifted my weight slightly, grounding myself in the present, reminding myself that I was still standing in the middle of a restaurant, still surrounded by people who had begun to return to their routines, even if they were quieter now, more aware, and I lowered my gaze for a brief second before lifting it again, not in submission but in thought, because something inside me refused to completely retreat, refused to shrink back into the version of myself that would have apologized and disappeared without question, and I realized that he had seen that too. That whatever he had noticed earlier had not been just the action, it had been the choice behind it, the refusal to step back even when it would have been easier, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant he understood something about me that I had not intended to reveal, and I was not sure how I felt about that. Not yet, and the silence between us shifted again, not tense, not comfortable either, something in between, something that felt like a decision forming. And then he glanced past me briefly, toward the service station, toward the path that led back into the part of the building where I belonged, before returning his attention to me. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, but more final. "Finish your shift," he said, and for a second I blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it, because it sounded like dismissal, like a return to normal, and part of me wanted to accept that immediately, to take the opportunity and walk away, to pretend that this entire interaction had been contained within these few minutes and would not follow me beyond them. But something in the way he said it told me that was not what he meant, not entirely, and I felt it again, that invisible thread pulling tight between us, that sense that this was not the end of anything, just a pause, a temporary separation before something else continued, and I nodded once, because there was nothing else I could do in that moment, no words that would fit, no response that would make sense. And as I finally stepped back, turning toward the service area once more, I could feel his gaze linger for just a second longer before it lifted, and that second was enough to leave a mark, enough to make it clear that whatever had started tonight had not been left behind in that space. It had simply been delayed, and as I moved back into the rhythm of work, picking up tasks, answering orders, forcing my focus onto the familiar, I realized that for the first time since I had started this job, the end of my shift did not feel like an escape. It felt like the beginning of something I was not prepared for. The rest of the shift passed in fragments, not in a smooth line like it usually did, but in moments that felt slightly disconnected from each other, like I was moving through something that looked familiar but did not feel the same anymore. And I focused on what I could control, refilling glasses, clearing tables, responding to quiet requests with practiced efficiency. But every now and then I felt it again, that subtle awareness, that quiet pull towards something just outside my reach, and I did not need to look to know where it came from. Because even when I avoided that direction, even when I kept my eyes down and my movements precise, I could still feel the weight of his presence somewhere in the room, steady and unmoving, like a constant I could not ignore, and it made time pass differently, slower in some ways, faster in others, until eventually the rhythm of the night began to wind down, conversations softening, guests leaving in measured waves, the energy shifting from sharp and watchful to something quieter, more contained, and when the last of my assigned tables cleared, I allowed myself a small breath, a moment of stillness at the edge of the service station, my hands resting lightly against the counter as I looked out across the room, expecting, for a second, for everything to feel normal again, for the night to settle into something I could leave behind. But it did not, because even as the space emptied, even as the staff began their closing routines, I noticed the one thing that had not changed, the table at the center, still occupied, still anchored by him, and something in my chest tightened, not with fear, not exactly, but with a kind of certainty I had been avoiding all night, because I knew, without needing confirmation, that this was not over, that the simple instruction to finish my shift had never been meant as an ending, only a pause, and I straightened slowly, wiping my hands on a clean cloth more out of habit than necessity, my mind running through possibilities I could not quite define, because leaving now, walking out the back in trance like I always did, catching the late bus home and pretending none of this had happened, felt like an option in theory, but not in reality, not anymore. and I hesitated for just a second too long, long enough to feel that invisible thread pull tight. Again, long enough to realize that avoiding this would not make it disappear, and so, without fully deciding to, I found myself moving, one step at a time, not toward the exit, but toward the space I had tried to leave behind earlier, my pace steady, my expression composed in the way I had learned to maintain no matter what I felt underneath. And as I approached, I saw that Victoria was gone, her seat empty, her presence erased from the table as if she had never been there at all, and that absence said more than anything else could have, because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that whatever balance had existed before had shifted permanently. And when I stopped a few feet away, the same distance he had chosen earlier, Adrian looked up, his gaze finding mine immediately, not surprised, not questioning, as if he had expected this, as if he had known I would come back without being told. And for a second neither of us spoke, the quiet between us different now, less tense, more defined, like the outline of something that had finally taken shape. And then he leaned back slightly, his expression calm, certain, and said the words that made everything inside me still. From tonight, you do not stand in the background anymore. And I felt the meaning settle before I could react, before I could decide what it meant or what I wanted it to mean, because some decisions were not offered as choices. They were presented as facts, and standing there in the fading light of a room that no longer felt like my world, I realized that whatever life I had been living before this moment had just shifted into something else entirely, something I could not step away from, no matter how much I might have wanted to. Because the moment he had chosen to see me, everything had already changed.